Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The fog that October evening lay upon Baker Street like an old grey shawl, muffling the wheels of the last omnibuses and pooling in the gutters until the lamps shone as if through watered silk. Mrs. Hudson had already drawn the curtains against the damp, and a cheerful blaze had set the coal to a low, contented purr. Holmes, who had spent the day in a languid experiment upon the properties of certain coal-tar derivatives, had stretched himself upon the settee with his long fingers steepled under his chin and his gaze fixed upon the curling smoke rings that drifted toward the ceiling. Dr. Watson, ever attentive to the change of season and the catarrhs it encouraged, was in the act of laying out his medical bag upon the table when there came, not a knock, but a hard, unceremonious thud at our very door. Mrs. Hudson cried out. Holmes was upon his feet before the sound had fully died. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled the door wide. There, upon the mat, a man sagged like a sailor struck by a sudden squall. He was of middle years, decently dressed in a clerk's black with a bowler hat he had failed to remove, and his gloved right hand clutched a small brown parcel tied with string as if it were the last citadel of his strength. "Inside," said Holmes with a command that brooked no delay. He slipped a hand under the fellow's arm and guided him to the nearest chair. The man's lips had blued with the cold or with greater mischief. His eyes rolled upward, and his breath came in shallow rasps, lifting the lapel of his coat in the jerking rhythm of distress. Watson, in that steady, decisive manner which had comforted soldiers far from London's fogs, loosened the man's collar and placed a hand against his chest. "Pulse irregular. There is a constriction. Holmes, the tongue, yes." He reached for his bag, uncorked a restorative, and coaxed a few drops through the clenched teeth. The man swallowed with visible effort. Holmes's attention had fixed upon the parcel. In one swift motion he slit the string with the penknife kept upon the mantel. Within lay a pocket watch of notable antiquity, its silver case chased with ivy leaves, the glass so fogged from the evening that it showed the blurred face of time itself. Beside it, wrapped separately in tissue, a sliver of something black and crumbly, char perhaps, or some mineral, and a folded scrap of paper as narrow as a tally from a publican's ledger. The stranger saw Holmes's hand move, and with a convulsive start he latched his glove more tightly about the parcel. The effort cost him dear. A fit of coughing seized him, and when it had passed, the man's voice emerged in a hoarse whisper, each word shorn of comfort. "It watches," he said, "from above. No feet upon the stair, no sound, only the shadow upon the ceiling. You must. Baker Street." His eyes, fever-bright, darted to the corners of our ceiling as if expecting some creeping doom even there. Then with a shuddering breath, he thrust the parcel toward Holmes. "For you." "Who sent it?" Watson asked, bending near. "Your name, sir?" The man's gaze settled upon Watson with fleeting gratitude. "To Jarvis," he managed. "Thomas Jarvis. The office." His gloved left hand rose as if to indicate some direction, but only trembled in the air like a needle hunting a true north. "The lamps go down. He said it would be safe, but he lied. Tell her ladyship." The words broke upon his tongue like waves upon a shingle, and whatever message might have followed was lost to the silence that succeeded. Watson's fingers pressed at the man's throat, feeling for that stubborn thread of life, but its last fibres had already frayed. He looked up, grave and certain. "He's gone." Holmes, who had not so much as blinked during Jarvis's utterance, closed the man's eyes with a gentleness at odds with the sharp angles of his countenance. "Mrs. Hudson?" he called softly, and when she appeared, pale with alarm, he spoke with that calm which transforms panic into procedure. "A constable, if you please. Tell him that Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street requests his immediate attendance, and Mr. Lestrade, if he is within reach." As our landlady hurried off, Holmes turned the dead man's left hand over in his own. The glove, cheap but new, bore a smear upon the palm, as if the wearer had once pressed it firmly against a surface fouled by soot. Holmes examined the residue under the lamp. It was not the common fare of London smoke. There was a crystalline glitter within the blackness, and a faint, acrid odour that stung the nose. Watson, tidying the poor stranger's collar with that respect owed to the defeated, observed, "Poison, perhaps, at the spasms, the breath, the tongue?" "A possibility," Holmes allowed, "but he has braved the fog and fate itself to bring us a parcel. Let us see what trinkets have carried him to his end." He lifted the watch between thumb and forefinger. It had ceased its ticking, as if time itself had taken off its boots to tread more carefully. Upon the case's interior a neat engraving read, "To R.J. with all constancy, E.H. 1874. The chain, a handsome one, had snapped and been mended with a vulgar bit of string, as if the owner had neither leisure nor tools for proper repair. Holmes unfolded the narrow scrap of paper. Upon it, in a taut, spidery hand, was written a single line. No, 17 when the shadow climbs. He raised his brows at Watson. "The watch gives us one story, this another. Together they whisper a third." Before Watson could reply, a clatter sounded upon the stair, and in came Inspector Lestrade, the tails of his coat damp with fog and his hair pinched flat by a hat worn long past comfort. "Holmes," he said without preamble, "if this is another of your practical—" "Good Lord." His gaze took in the still figure, and his tone sobered at once. "Who is he?" "A messenger who arrived at our door with his last breath. Thomas Jarvis, clerk by his dress and nails, though the matters he carried may lift him beyond that simple station. You are in luck, Lestrade. Fate has brought one of your puzzles to our hearth." Lestrade looked not at all as though he counted it luck. "I have puzzles enough for two men," he said. "There's panic after nightfall in the Marylebone division. 3 nights running, the lamps in a particular stretch of streets have been snuffed as if by some unseen hand. I can find no tampering with the mains, and the lamplighters are at their wits' end. On each of those nights, a watchman or errand runner reports a shadow moving across the upper walls, no man seen to cast it, and then some mischief follows. A warehouse opened without marks upon the lock, a safe door found yawning where the key has not left its owner's pocket. And last night, in Welbeck Street, a gentleman's study rifled, though the window is latched from within. No footprints, no ladder, no tool left behind. What's worse, this afternoon a lady of standing sent word to the yard that her household is in fear from some presence above the ceiling and begs for discreet protection. I had it in mind to consult you tomorrow." Holmes's eyes had sharpened to points of light. "Your lady of standing, her initials E.H., by any wild chance?" Lestrade's surprise was plain. "You are uncanny, Holmes. Lady Eveline Harbury of Cavendish Square. But how—" Holmes tapped the inner lid of the watch. "Constancy is a virtue in both sentiment and metalwork, Inspector. We shall endeavour to return this to its owner with interest." Lestrade crouched near the dead man and sniffed at the smear upon the glove. "That's soot again. We've found traces of it on a windowsill 2 stories up, where no mortal without wings could have reached. The lamplighters swear it isn't theirs, and I'll eat my hat if it's ordinary coal dust. It pricks at the nose." "Quite," Holmes murmured. He lifted the small black sliver from its tissue, held it to the light, and let the tiniest particles fall back like dark snow. "An alien admixture. There is a mine in this city deeper than any shaft at Newcastle, Lestrade, and its mouth is no larger than the bell of a lamp." He laid the fragment down and regarded the paper scrap once more. "No. 17 when the shadow climbs." "No. 17 what? No, 17 where? There are a dozen streets with such a number between Baker Street and Cavendish Square alone." Watson, who had formed a habit of privately composing himself before the onset of Holmes's whirlwind, could not help a shiver as the fog pressed more closely against the panes and the fire cracked as if in answer to some distant signal. A dead man at our threshold, a watch that belonged to a lady in fear, a soot that was not soot, and shadows that moved where no feet trod. These were the ingredients of a broth to Holmes's taste, if ever there were. Holmes straightened, his expression now that sharp, ascetic mask which Watson had come to recognize as the sign of war declared. "We shall need a cab," he said. "Inspector, keep your lamplighters at their posts and your constables with their eyes above the street, not upon it. Doctor, your bag. There is a square where the fog chooses to linger, and a house where the ceiling has more to tell than the carpets. If our caller spoke true, Baker Street is not the only place over which a shadow has settled tonight." The cab rattled through the fog-shrouded streets as Holmes sat forward in tense concentration, his fingers drumming lightly against the handle of his cane. Beside him, Inspector Lestrade shifted uneasily, the lamplight glancing across his sharp features whenever the vehicle lurched beneath a passing gaslight. I, for my part, could not help but glance at the parcel upon Holmes's knee, the watch, the scrap of paper, and that strange fragment of soot which he had sealed within a glass vial. The night pressed close about us, and every sound beyond the cab's windows seemed subdued, as though London herself held her breath. "Lestrade," Holmes began suddenly, "at what hour were the last of the disturbances reported?" "Between 9:30 and 11, mostly," replied the inspector. "Always within those 2 hours, when the fog is thickest and the lamplighters have long finished their rounds. No one's ever seen the shadow come or go, only that it climbs, just as the dead man said. One moment the street's clear, the next a shape moves across the upper windows as though cast by someone walking upon the roofs." Holmes nodded slowly. "And the district?" "Mostly around Welbeck Street and Cavendish Square. A few scattered complaints near Wigmore, but those may be hysteria spreading from the rest." Holmes leaned back, folding his arms. "Welbeck Street? Yes. That gives us the heart of the pattern. The dead man spoke of a shadow that climbs, and the paper mentions number 17. Lestrade, do we find such a number upon any of those streets?" "There's a number 17 Welbeck Street, as it happens," said Lestrade. "Belongs to an art collector, Sir Reginald Harker. Been abroad these past months, though his housekeeper swears the place is locked tight. I sent a man to look. He found nothing amiss, except that the lamps on that stretch had gone out the same night as the last burglary." Holmes smiled faintly. "And it seems the fates conspire to bring us there. You may tell your man that we will do the looking this time." The cab drew to a halt before a row of respectable residences, their windows dark and curtained, the fog drifting like pale smoke between the lamp-posts. Even so, I sensed that curious prickle at the back of the neck, which comes when unseen eyes are near. Holmes stepped down first, his keen gaze sweeping the upper facades, then the gutter lines and chimneys above. "The lamps," he murmured. "Snuffed again tonight." Indeed, the gaslights nearest number 17 had all gone out, though the flame burned steadily a dozen yards away. The darkness here was unnatural, denser than the fog could account for. Lestrade muttered something under his breath and signalled his constable to remain by the corner. We mounted the steps of number 17. Holmes bent to the lock, examined it with his lens, then withdrew a thin tool from his pocket, and with delicate precision raised the latch. Sir Reginald's reputation will survive our intrusion better than his silver plate would another night's visitation, Holmes observed dryly. Step lightly, gentlemen. Inside, the air was thick with disuse, carrying that faint odour of varnish and dust peculiar to shuttered houses. Our lantern beams caught the gleam of framed canvases upon the walls and the pale marble of statuary standing like ghosts in the gloom. Holmes moved ahead with the grace of a cat, pausing only to study the faint disturbance of the hall's carpet pile. "Someone has been here since the servants locked up," he said. "Note the trail, narrow, deliberate, and recently made. The edges are still soft." We followed the prints into a drawing room at the rear of the house. Here, a single tall window faced the courtyard. Holmes approached it, held the lantern low, and uttered a short exclamation. "Watson, observe. The latch is untouched, yet there are smudges upon the sill, that same crystalline soot again, finer even than before." He gathered a trace upon a slip of paper, sealed it away, and then, quite suddenly, his head lifted. Somewhere above us, a faint scuffing sounded. Then silence. Lestrade froze. "Upstairs?" he whispered. Holmes nodded once and raised a finger for silence. The sound came again, softer this time, a dragging, intermittent motion, like fabric brushing across wood. He motioned for the lantern to be dimmed and began his ascent, each step measured, his eyes fixed upon the landing above. When we reached the upper corridor, the fog from the courtyard had seeped through a half-open skylight, filling the passage with an eerie pallor. A portrait upon the far wall caught what little light remained, the painted eyes seeming to follow us as we advanced. Then the sound returned, directly overhead this time. "The attic," Holmes murmured. Lestrade reached for his revolver, but Holmes stopped him with a slight shake of the head. "Let us not startle our quarry into flight. He or it may be more than we can pursue in the fog." He pushed open the attic door. The lantern's glow revealed beams hung with cobwebs, old furniture shrouded in sheets, and the faint glimmer of dust motes swirling through the cold air. For a moment, all seemed still. Then from the far end, something shifted behind a stack of crates, a shadow, tall and quick, sliding across the wall with uncanny speed. Lestrade sprang forward. "There!" But Holmes caught his arm. "Wait!" His gaze darted upward. "You see? The movement, not the mover. The light upon the roof through that broken pane, something passes before it." I followed his gesture, and indeed saw a darker shape gliding above, cast through the hole in the glass. Holmes crossed to the window, unlatched it, and peered out onto the roofline. "There are footprints here," he whispered, "but, fascinating. They are burned into the lead as though seared by heat." We climbed through after him, the chill wind biting our faces. The roofs stretched away like black islands in a sea of fog. For several minutes we searched in vain. Then Holmes crouched beside a vent pipe and held his lantern close. A small cylindrical device lay half-hidden in the gutter, its metal casing scorched and streaked with that same crystalline residue. "An electrical lamp," Holmes said softly, "but of a kind far beyond common manufacture, self-igniting perhaps with some volatile compound. The shadow that climbs is no man at all, but the projection of this infernal invention." He examined the casing, his eyes glinting. "And if the power source is what I suspect, the risk to its user would be considerable." Lestrade scowled. "So you're saying our burglar uses this to blind the lamplighters to make people think they see ghosts?" "Partly," Holmes replied, pocketing the device. "But there is artistry here, an intention beyond mere theft. Someone wishes to weave fear itself into these streets. Fear creates silence, and silence makes excellent cover." We descended once more, but as Holmes closed the window behind us, I fancied I heard a faint echo in the fog beyond, a whisper or the hiss of gas escaping through metal. Holmes paused upon the stair, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he said quietly, "tonight we have glimpsed the edge of a shadow, greater than we know. It walks above us even now, unseen yet near. Tomorrow we shall call upon Lady Eveline Harbury, and perhaps then we shall learn whose hand has drawn this darkness over Baker Street." The following morning dawned pale and uneasy, the fog lingering like a memory that refused to lift. A thin drizzle pattered against the panes of Baker Street, where Holmes, already deep in contemplation, stood at the window with his dressing gown hanging loose about him and a cigarette smouldering between his fingers. Upon the table lay the cylindrical device recovered from the roof of number 17, a queer contrivance of brass and glass, faintly scorched along its seams, with a dial too small to be of any ordinary mechanical purpose. Beside it, the fragments of the crystalline soot glimmered faintly under the light of my lamp, as if reluctant to surrender their secret. Holmes broke the silence. "Watson, you observed last night that the odour from the residue resembled burnt phosphorus, did you not?" "I did," I said, "though the addition of that acrid tang, almost metallic, suggested to me some chemical unknown to ordinary combustion." "Precisely," he replied. "You have the makings of a chemist in you yet. I have subjected it to the flame and the lens, and found traces of magnesium combined with what appears to be selenium, an element rarely used outside of experimental circles. There is also a faint crystalline deposit of lithium carbonate, suggesting an electrical reaction. In short, we are dealing with a device capable of intense illumination, though portable enough to be carried by hand. Its light, when directed upon the fog or a wall, would produce a shifting image of whatever lens lies within." I leaned forward. "Then the shadow that the witnesses saw was an illusion, projected by this infernal contraption?" "An illusion, yes," said Holmes, "but one with a most deliberate purpose. Think, Watson, what better way to commit one's misdeeds than under the guise of a phantom? The common man will lock his doors against burglars, but he trembles and hides from spirits. Our adversary has found a way to walk unseen by convincing the world that what it sees is unearthly." I could not help but shudder. "And the man Jarvis? How does he fit into this?" Holmes exhaled a slow stream of smoke, watching it coil through the air like thought made visible. "He was a messenger, that much is clear. The watch engraved with Lady Eveline Harbury's initials suggests that she, or someone close to her, entrusted him with that parcel. His death, therefore, was either accidental, a result of exposure to this chemical device, or deliberate, to silence him before he could deliver his warning." "Then you believe Lady Harbury is in danger?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that she is inextricably bound to this affair. Whether as victim, witness, or something subtler, we shall see. Our path, my dear Watson, lies toward Cavendish Square." He rang for breakfast with the air of a man preparing for battle. Within the hour we were rattling once more through the wet streets, Lestrade having sent word that he would meet us at Lady Harbury's residence. As the cab turned into the square, the great houses emerged from the mist like silent judges, their white facades streaked with rain. The Harbury home was the most distinguished among them, a fine Georgian mansion with a polished brass knocker and ivy creeping along the lower balcony. The door was opened by a butler whose expression betrayed both fatigue and apprehension. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson," Holmes announced briskly. "We are expected." The man bowed and led us through a hall that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Lady Eveline Harbury awaited us in a drawing-room whose every detail spoke of refinement, a grand piano by the window, a portrait of her late husband above the hearth, and curtains drawn half-closed against the dreary light. She rose as we entered, a woman of perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked faintly with silver and eyes that had known more wakeful nights than rest. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "you received the watch." Holmes inclined his head. "Delivered to us under tragic circumstances. I regret to inform you that your messenger, Thomas Jarvis, is dead." Her composure faltered. She sank slightly against the chair's arm. "Poor man. I feared as much when he did not return. He was my late husband's clerk, most loyal. I sent him to you because I dared not call the police directly. They would have dismissed it as hysteria." "Please, Lady Harbury," said Holmes gently. "Tell us everything." She clasped her hands tightly. "For several weeks now, strange occurrences have unsettled this house. At first, it was trifling. The lights dimming without cause, footsteps in the upper rooms where none should be. My servants fled after the second incident, and I have lived since with only Mr. Jarvis and my maid, Clara. 3 nights ago I woke to find a shadow upon my ceiling, tall, thin, and moving, though no light burned in the room. It bent as though to look upon me. When I cried out, the window burst open though the latch was fastened. Jarvis rushed in and the thing vanished. He found the watch upon the floor beside my bed, though it had been locked in my husband's study for years." Watson glanced at Holmes, whose eyes had sharpened to that hawk-like intensity I knew so well. "Your husband's study?" he repeated. "Might we see it?" She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "This way." We followed her through a narrow corridor to a smaller chamber overlooking the garden. The air within was cooler, heavy with the scent of old tobacco and dust. Upon the desk lay scattered papers, but Holmes's attention went at once to the window where a faint smear of the same black residue clung to the frame. "Do you notice, Watson," he murmured, "the faint indentation upon the sill? Someone has placed a device here, perhaps our same projector, and directed its light upward toward the bedroom above. The result would be precisely what her ladyship describes, a moving shadow upon the ceiling, conjured from the fog itself." He knelt to examine the floorboards, tracing a thin line of scratches toward a cabinet in the corner. With a swift motion he pulled the cabinet aside, revealing a small metal conduit leading downward through the wall. "Ah," he said quietly, "an electrical connection, concealed, but recently disturbed. Lady Harbury, your house has been entered not through the windows, but through the very wires that light it. Whoever built this network knew your husband's systems intimately." She brought a trembling hand to her lips. "Then someone within the household?" "Someone with knowledge," said Holmes. "Your late husband, I understand, dabbled in scientific experiments?" She nodded. "Yes. He was an enthusiast of new electrical methods, his study filled with such instruments. After his death I had them sealed away, but the house's wiring remains as he designed it." Holmes stood slowly, his expression grave. "Then, my lady, it seems that your husband's inventions have been turned against you. Somewhere within these walls a hand has reawakened them, and unless I am mistaken, that same hand now casts the shadow which haunts both your nights and London's streets." He turned to me with that electric gleam of purpose I had come to recognize as the herald of action. "Watson, tonight we shall keep watch here. The shadow will climb again, and when it does, I intend to learn the form that casts it." The evening returned with a heaviness that seemed almost deliberate, the fog rolling back into Cavendish Square as if summoned by some unspoken design. Lady Harbury's household, stripped now to a single maid and butler, moved with hushed precision under Holmes's instructions. Curtains were drawn, lamps extinguished save for one low flame in the study, and a single candle placed upon the desk above the hidden conduit. The house seemed to hold its breath. Holmes himself was tireless, pacing from window to window, every sound in the gloom sharpening his attention rather than dulling it. I had seen him before in such moods, his mind drawn taut as a violin string, vibrating to the slightest tremor of deceit. By 10 o'clock Lestrade had arrived, his coat still glistening with the fine drizzle outside. "You're certain this is necessary, Holmes?" he muttered. "The yard doesn't like ghost hunting, and my men are freezing their boots off in the fog." "Courage, Inspector," Holmes said with faint amusement. "You shall have your burglar before dawn, though he may wear a shroud of light rather than cloth. Watson, you and Lestrade will remain here in the study. I shall take my position upstairs in her ladyship's room, for it is there the shadow seems fondest of appearing. Lady Harbury has consented to rest in her dressing-room nearby. I'll have need of your sharp eyes below, should the machinery rouse again." Holmes gathered his tools, a lantern, his magnifier, and the curious brass device we had brought from Welbeck Street, and ascended the stairs with noiseless grace. Lestrade and I took our places as instructed, the only illumination the flickering candle upon the desk and the faint amber glow from the corridor. The ticking of the clock grew unnaturally loud, punctuating the silence like the breath of the house itself. Nearly an hour passed. The fog pressed close against the window panes. The fire had sunk to red embers. I was just remarking on the stillness when a faint tremor ran beneath my feet. Lestrade stiffened. The candle flame wavered once, twice, and then, as though pinched by invisible fingers, went out. "Holmes," I called softly upward, but there came no answer. The darkness deepened, swallowing the outlines of furniture, and for an instant I fancied that the shadows themselves had grown thicker. Then, through the gloom, a faint hum began, a mechanical vibration rising from within the wall near the conduit Holmes had discovered. The sound swelled, a faint rhythmic pulse like a heart beating through iron. "Look there!" Lestrade whispered sharply. A dull light seeped from the edges of the cabinet, the same cold, silvery hue we had glimpsed in the fog outside number 17. It climbed the wall, wavering and alive, and then stretched upward in a long, distorted form, the unmistakable outline of a man's figure bending forward as though searching the floor for something unseen. Yet there was no substance to it, only light and shadow playing upon the plaster. Holmes's voice came suddenly from above, low but firm. "Hold your ground! Do not move until I give the word!" Even as he spoke, a sharper sound cut through the air, a faint metallic snap from within the conduit, followed by the hiss of escaping gas. Lestrade made for the wall, revolver drawn, but Holmes's command rang out again, this time from the stairwell. "Stop! You'll bring the whole thing down upon us!" He appeared a moment later, his eyes gleaming in the half-light. "Watson, your lantern," he said briskly. I lit it at once and passed it to him. He crouched beside the cabinet, examining the aperture where the strange conduit met the floor. "Just as I feared," he murmured. A battery rigged to ignite a volatile gas mixture, a crude but deadly means of concealment. One misstep, and the house would have vanished into flame. Lestrade swore softly. "Then the shadow?" "Is a warning," Holmes said grimly. "Our adversary knew we might watch tonight. He sent us a sign instead of his presence, but he also made a mistake." He pointed to the floor, where faint footprints, thin streaks of soot and chemical dust, led toward the door. "Someone was here scarcely an hour ago, perhaps even while we were speaking with her ladyship." We followed the trail into the corridor, the prints barely visible but distinct in pattern, the sole narrow, the heel worn unevenly. Holmes examined them with evident satisfaction. An artisan's shoe, foreign make, worn by a man accustomed to climbing or crouching. Note the pressure of the toes. He moves with stealth but not fear. This is a professional. Lady Harbury appeared at the far end of the corridor, pale and trembling. "Mr. Holmes, what has happened? I heard—" "Nothing to alarm you, my lady," Holmes interrupted gently. "But I must ask, did your husband employ any foreign craftsman during his experiments, particularly someone with knowledge of fine electrical instruments?" She frowned, searching her memory. "There was one. Herr Weber, a German engineer. He assisted my husband for several months before leaving England after his death." "Why?" Holmes's expression hardened. "Because he has not left England at all. He has merely changed his address and his trade." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, your men are to cover every approach to this house. I believe our quarry will return once he believes his trick has frightened us away. But we shall remain precisely where we are. Watson, you will stay with Lady Harbury and her maid. Lestrade, guard the study. I shall take the roof." "The roof?" I exclaimed. Holmes smiled faintly. "Where better to catch a shadow than at the source of its light?" He disappeared up the stair, and for the next half-hour the house was silent, save for the faint murmur of the wind through the chimneys. Then, as the clock struck midnight, a sound came from above, the faint scrape of a boot upon slate. I froze, listening. Again it came, cautious, deliberate. I could picture Holmes crouched behind a chimney stack, his keen eyes fixed upon that ghostly shimmer rising from the fog below. Suddenly there was a shout, a scuffle, and the unmistakable crack of breaking glass. I rushed to the window just in time to see a figure drop from the rooftop to the garden path below. A dark shape, wrapped in a long coat, clutching something metallic that glowed faintly in the dark. Holmes was after him in an instant, leaping the parapet like a hawk in pursuit. Lestrade and I tore through the house and out into the mist, where the chase twisted between the garden walls and into the narrow alley beyond. The fugitive ran with astonishing speed, his path marked by flashes of silver light as the device in his hand flickered wildly. Holmes gained ground steadily, his long limbs cutting through the fog with relentless precision. At last, near the mews behind the square, the man turned sharply and vanished into a stable yard. When we reached it seconds later, he was gone. Only the faint smell of ozone lingered, and a small scrap of paper pinned to the door with a knife. Holmes tore it free and held it to the lantern. Upon it was written, in the same spidery hand as before, "The light must climb before it falls. No, 17 still waits." Holmes folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. His voice, when he spoke, was low and measured. "So, Watson, the shadow has not finished its ascent. It merely moves to a new height. Tomorrow we return to Welbeck Street. There, beneath the lamps, I believe our phantom truly lives." Morning crept upon London with that dull, metallic light peculiar to the city after a night of fog. The streets still steamed faintly as we rode toward Welbeck Street once more, the air heavy with the odour of damp brick and horse harness. Holmes, wrapped in his greatcoat and with his collar turned high, spoke scarcely a word during the journey. He sat with his head bent and his fingertips pressed together, the small slip of paper bearing the message. "The light must climb before it falls," resting between them as though it were some ciphered scripture demanding revelation. I had learned better than to interrupt his silences. They were the crucible from which his solutions emerged. At length he stirred. "Watson," he said, "you will remember the phrase in both the messages left by our adversary, 'When the shadow climbs,' and now 'the light must climb before it falls. To the untrained ear they sound poetic, but to the trained mind they are mechanical. I glanced at him. Mechanical? Indeed, a shadow climbs only when light descends, or when the source of illumination moves upward. I believe the phrase describes not metaphor, but motion. What we witnessed upon the walls and roofs was no apparition. It was a calculated experiment in projection. The device we found was merely one of many. Then number 17? Is the laboratory, said Holmes, and last night we frightened its keeper from his nest, yet he has challenged us still. No, 17 waits, he says. That, my dear fellow, is invitation enough. By the time we reached the corner of Welbeck Street, Lestrade and 2 constables were already in position. The fog had lifted somewhat, and in the wan sunlight the row of houses appeared respectable, their shutters drawn, their doors quiet and proper. Yet there was something too perfect about their stillness. Holmes's keen gaze passed from window to window, from roof line to drain pipe, and then settled upon the narrow alley that separated number 17 from its neighbour. "Observe," he said, "the soot upon the bricks, recently disturbed. Someone has been climbing here." We followed him down the alley. A locked gate barred the rear courtyard, but Holmes produced his pick, and in a moment the latch yielded with barely a whisper. Inside, the yard was paved with flagstones slick from the rain. A thin coil of wire ran from the rear window up toward the roof, vanishing into a narrow aperture where the brickwork had been pried loose. Holmes bent over it, his expression one of profound interest. "Electric cabling of private design," he murmured. "No connection to the city's supply. See the insulation, gutta percha and resin. This was done by a craftsman's hand." We entered the house by the back door, which creaked faintly on its hinges, but offered no resistance. The interior smelled of oil and metal filings, and a faint hum, like the memory of an echo, seemed to vibrate through the air. Dust lay thick upon the furniture, yet footprints tracked through it in a careful pattern. Light, deliberate, looping from the hallway to the stairs and back again as though the walker paced in thought. Holmes stooped to examine the marks. "He has been here within hours," he said softly. "The dust upon the upper ridges of the heel has not yet settled. We must tread with the care of cats." We climbed to the first floor, where the faint hum grew clearer. At the end of a corridor stood a door slightly ajar. Holmes motioned for silence and pushed it open. What met our eyes was no common workshop, but a veritable theatre of scientific obsession. The room was lined with glass lenses, mirrors and cylinders, all arranged toward a central contrivance that occupied most of the floor, a mass of wires, gears and lamp housings connected to a series of batteries humming faintly in unison. The air reeked of ozone. Holmes approached the machine and examined its dials. "So," he murmured, "Herr Weber has perfected his craft. This apparatus could project an image several hundred yards in the air, magnified through the mist. The illusion of a moving shadow would appear upon walls wherever the beam struck fog or smoke. Ingenious and perilous, the heat of the arc lamp alone would be sufficient to ignite gas." Lestrade whistled softly. "So this is your ghost maker?" "Precisely, but note, the machine is active. The current flows even now, which means our friend intends to use it again, perhaps tonight." He traced the main cable to a side table where a ledger lay open. Scrawled across its pages were lists of times, coordinates, and short notes in German script. Holmes scanned them quickly. "Cavendish Square, Marylebone, Paddington Basin," he translated aloud. "Each location corresponds to the nights of the disturbances. Yet here, look, tonight's entry, Baker Street, 21:30. I felt a chill. "Baker Street?" "Yes," said Holmes grimly. It appears the hunter has become the hunted. He means to strike at our own door. A fine compliment, but an unwise one. Before he could speak further, the floorboards above us creaked. Holmes froze. "He is here," he whispered. "Stay by the door, Watson." Lestrade, "Quietly, if you please." We held our breath. A soft step moved across the ceiling, then another and a third, slow, deliberate, as if the man above measured each motion. Then suddenly a faint metallic click. Holmes darted to the nearest wall, his eyes scanning upward. "There's a vent above," he hissed. "He's releasing gas into the flue. Down!" The words were scarcely out before a spark leapt from one of the lamps, igniting a sharp blue flame that raced along the wire. Holmes seized the main switch and wrenched it backward. The flames sputtered out, leaving behind a cloud of acrid smoke. Lestrade was already halfway up the stairs, revolver drawn, when Holmes called, "No! He'll have prepared an exit!" We followed regardless, the boards groaning underfoot. The upper room was small and empty save for a skylight thrown wide. A coil of rope hung from it, swaying in the draught. Holmes climbed to the opening and peered into the brightness beyond. "Gone," he said. "But not far." He reached down and held up something that glimmered in the light, a small brass medallion, stamped with the letter W. "The mark of our elusive engineer," he murmured. "He leaves it like a craftsman signing his art. Pride will betray him yet." Lestrade pocketed the evidence. "If he plans to strike at Baker Street tonight, we'll have him waiting in irons before the lamps are lit." Holmes shook his head. "No, Inspector, you will not find him with constables in the street. He will come unseen with his lights above the fog. The moment we make him aware that we know, he'll vanish into the city and begin anew. No, our best trap is silence. Let him think us unprepared." He turned to me, his eyes alight with quiet fire. "Watson, tonight we shall be at home early. The shadow intends to climb above Baker Street once more. This time it shall meet something more unyielding than fog." The fog returned that evening, as though summoned by our adversary's will, thick and suffocating, rolling over Baker Street in slow, silent billows that turned the lamps into pale globes suspended in milk. Inside our familiar sitting room, Holmes was a figure of restless focus. He had cleared the table of its usual clutter of newspapers and chemical flasks, replacing them with an assortment of electrical coils, copper wire, and a pair of glass lenses recently polished to perfection. I had long since abandoned my medical journal, knowing it would be a futile attempt at distraction. Holmes in such moods was a storm contained within human form, every gesture precise, every silence charged. Lestrade had departed at dusk to place his men discreetly about the surrounding streets. Holmes had insisted upon secrecy, no uniformed constables loitering near our door, no movement that might betray vigilance. Our visitor, he had said, must believe us oblivious. He must think himself unseen to act freely. Only then can we observe him in the raw. Now he worked by lamplight, adjusting the smaller of the two lenses until its reflection fell upon the fog-streaked window. "Watson," he said suddenly, "you recall the device we found at Welbeck Street, the one designed to project its light across distance through vapour?" "Of course." "I have adapted it slightly," he said, a gleam of satisfaction passing through his eyes. "We shall not meet his light with darkness, but with reflection. If he attempts his spectacle above Baker Street, my apparatus here will reverse the effect, scattering his own beam and revealing its point of origin. For once, we shall make the shadow show its master." I could not suppress a smile at his confidence. "You propose to catch light with light?" "Precisely," said Holmes, adjusting a small copper switch. "An experiment most poetic. When two illusions meet, truth steps forward to introduce herself." The clock upon the mantel struck 9. The fog thickened, pressing against the window panes, as though curious about what transpired within. Holmes extinguished all but one lamp and drew the curtains slightly apart, allowing a sliver of the murky street to show. Outside, London lay muffled and soundless, save for the faint clip of a distant horse and the far-off clang of a bell at Marylebone Station. We waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Holmes did not move, his sharp profile etched against the dim glow of the hearth. My nerves, less disciplined than his, tingled with each creak of the settling house. It was nearly 9:30 when he spoke, so softly I might have missed it. "There," he said. I followed his gaze. Across the opposite building facade, a pale, wavering shape began to climb. It was tall, thin, almost human, its form rippling like smoke, yet moving with dreadful purpose. The shadow we had chased from Cavendish Square now rose silently over our own door. "Keep your place," Holmes murmured. "He watches to see if we notice." The apparition paused midway, as though listening. Then the light shifted, casting its phantom higher until it loomed upon the fog above the roofline, a towering silhouette that no earthly lantern could produce unaided. Holmes waited until its motion steadied, then threw a lever upon his instrument. Instantly, a narrow beam of pale light shot upward from our window, cutting through the mist in a single, trembling line. There came a faint hiss, then astonishingly a response. From somewhere beyond the rooftops a sharp flash answered, and for an instant the entire street was washed in cold brilliance. Holmes's beam wavered, caught, and then reflected back upon itself in a cascade of refracted glimmers. The effect was blinding, a battle of lights within the fog. Then just as quickly all faded to darkness once more. Holmes sprang to the window and flung it open. "He's there!" he called. "On the opposite roof! Watson, this way!" I seized my coat and followed as he dashed from the room, down the stair, and into the street. The air was thick as wool, even the gas lamp struggled against it. Holmes moved with uncanny certainty, crossing the road and vaulting the low gate to the adjoining building. We mounted its steps and burst into the narrow stairwell beyond, the echo of our boots swallowed by plaster and fog. Above us, a faint scuffle sounded, then the crack of splintering glass. Holmes bounded upward 3 steps at a time. I followed, the revolver heavy in my hand. We emerged upon the rooftop just as a shape darted across the misty expanse, tall, wiry, coat flaring like wings. He carried a small metallic device that sputtered and smoked, its glow dying with every step. "Stop!" Holmes cried, his voice ringing through the vapor. The man spun about, his face half concealed by goggles. For an instant, the pale reflection of the arc lamp flickered across the lenses, and I caught the sharp outline of a scar cutting from temple to jaw. He hesitated, then hurled the device downward, where it shattered upon the slate tiles, bursting into a cloud of stinging fumes. Holmes coughed, eyes watering, but did not falter. "Weber!" he shouted. "Your hand in this is plain. Will you face me as a craftsman, or flee like a common thief?" The figure froze, then laughed. It was a cold, distorted sound, muffled by the fog. "You mistake me, Herr Holmes," came the reply, heavily accented. "I am no thief. I am a prophet of light. You see only shadows, but I—" The words ended in a hiss as Holmes lunged forward. There was a brief struggle, the faint glint of metal in Weber's hand, and then the man wrenched free, rolling toward the roof's edge. Holmes reached for him, but Weber twisted, pressing a button upon his wrist. A blinding flare burst forth, searing the fog into white fire. When my vision cleared, the rooftop was empty. Only the faint smell of burnt ozone lingered, and the shattered remnants of Weber's contraption glittered near the parapet. Holmes crouched beside them, unshaken, despite the near escape. So, he said quietly, he's developed it further, miniaturized, self-igniting, and capable of momentary brilliance equal to daylight. A weapon disguised as revelation. Lestrade's shout echoed from below. He and his men had arrived at last, their lanterns flickering faintly in the haze. "Did you get him, Holmes?" "Not tonight," Holmes replied, standing. "But he's made an error. He's shown his hand too soon. He believes his performance divine. He cannot resist an audience. And now we know where he will next seek one." He turned toward me, his expression alive with grim purpose. "Tomorrow, Watson, we visit the site of his true demonstration. These experiments in the fog are mere rehearsals. He intends to unveil his creation before London herself, where shadow and terror will merge in daylight. And when that hour comes, we shall be waiting in the wings." The next morning, London was abuzz with talk of strange lights above Baker Street. Rumours spread quickly through the fog-damp newspapers. Some claimed a meteor had passed low over the city. Others spoke of an electrical experiment gone awry. And one particularly fanciful account insisted that a ghostly apparition had been seen walking upon the clouds. Holmes read each report in silence, the faintest curve of amusement upon his lips. He had not slept, and yet his eyes gleamed with the intensity of a man who had already begun to play several moves ahead of his opponent. "Public curiosity is a powerful weapon, Watson," he said, laying the paper aside. "Weber's vanity will not allow him to remain in the shadows while his handiwork is misinterpreted by fools. The more the city speculates, the more certain it becomes that he will stage a public display to correct their ignorance. He cannot resist proving himself right." I poured the coffee and watched as he paced before the fire, the smoke from his cigarette curling into intricate shapes that matched the pattern of his thoughts. "You believe he intends a demonstration, an open one?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, and one of sufficient scale to restore his damaged pride. His note spoke of light that must climb before it falls. Yesterday, we saw that ascent. What remains is the descent, the fall of that same light upon its victims. Then we must find him before he acts." "Just so. I have already set certain wheels in motion. Lestrade's men are tracing the purchase of chemicals consistent with Weber's devices: magnesium, lithium carbonate, selenium. Such materials cannot be obtained without record, even in London's more discreet establishments. But there is another thread." He crossed to the mantel and took up the brass medallion we had recovered from Welbeck Street, turning it over in his fingers. "Do you notice this groove, Watson? The mark of a mounting screw. These were once attached to instruments, perhaps awards or symbols of membership. And here, beneath the grime, an inscription: Verein für wissenschaftliche Fortschritte, Berlin. The Society for Scientific Progress, I translated. Precisely. A German association known for sponsoring radical inventors. Weber was once one of their rising lights before being expelled for conducting dangerous demonstrations of electrical power, as the records show. It seems he has carried both his exile and his ambition into England. If he is to make his triumph known, he will seek an audience drawn from the scientific and social elite, those capable of appreciating his revelation. Tell me, Watson, where would such a gathering take place? I considered. The Royal Society, perhaps, or one of the engineering exhibitions. Holmes interrupted, snapping his fingers. The International Electrical Exposition at South Kensington. It opens tonight. Weber could not choose a grander stage. He will show them what he calls the light of the future, and the city may burn for his vanity. Without another word, he seized his coat and hat. Come, Watson, there is not a moment to lose. By late afternoon, we found ourselves amidst the bustle of South Kensington's exhibition grounds. The air was charged both with anticipation and literal electricity. Great cables hung from temporary pylons, feeding power to the endless displays of dynamos, filaments, and newly invented lamps that promised to illuminate all of London's darkness. Dignitaries and engineers moved among the exhibits, their conversation a hum of technical admiration. Yet Holmes's eyes searched not for novelty, but for danger. "There," he murmured, stopping abruptly before a large curtained structure at the far end of the hall. Above its entrance, a sign read, "The Dawn of a New Light, demonstration by Professor V.W. Adler." "Adler?" I repeated. "A convenient alias," Holmes said. "V for Victor, W for Weber. He conceals himself in plain sight. Observe the boldness of it. He means to unveil his invention to the public under a false name, believing none will connect him with the so-called ghost of Baker Street." Lestrade joined us moments later, having been summoned by telegraph. "My men are in position," he whispered. "If he so much as strikes a match, we'll have him." Holmes frowned slightly. "No, Lestrade, not yet. If you arrest him too soon, the crowd will panic, and half this hall is wired with his machinery. We must allow him to reveal enough of his scheme to expose its mechanism, but not enough to unleash catastrophe." As the clock struck 8, the curtain was drawn back, and a tall, gaunt figure stepped onto the small platform within. Even through his spectacles and neatly trimmed beard, I recognized Weber at once. The scar along his jaw was unmistakable. He bowed stiffly to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his accent barely disguised, "you have witnessed many lamps and wires tonight. But light, true light, must be liberated from its cage of filaments and fuel. I offer you illumination that walks the air itself, living fire, born of science, not superstition." A murmur of fascination rippled through the hall. He turned and gestured toward a massive contrivance behind him, an array of mirrored lenses and copper coils, not unlike the machine we had seen at Welbeck Street. Assistants in dark coats adjusted the levers as Weber's hand hovered over a switch. Holmes leaned close to me. "He has hidden his gas reservoir beneath the platform. When he activates the arc, the pressure will rupture the containment. If it ignites, the explosion will sweep this hall clean of life. Then we must stop him." "Not yet." Holmes's eyes glittered. "He must first make his confession." Weber spoke again, his voice rising with fervor. "They called me mad in Berlin. They banished me for dreaming of light without shadow. But tonight London shall see it, the fire that obeys no sun." He threw the switch. A blinding beam erupted from the machine, piercing the haze above the audience. The hall gasped as the beam expanded, forming the shape of a colossal, wavering figure, part man, part flame, towering against the glass dome. Weber spread his arms in triumph, but Holmes was already moving. With a sudden leap, he mounted the platform, seized the main cable, and tore it free with a single wrench. Sparks flew. The great figure above faltered, then collapsed into smoke. Weber turned in fury, clutching a pistol from his coat, but Lestrade's revolver barked first. The weapon flew from Weber's grasp, clattering across the floor. The crowd erupted into confusion. Some fled, others stared in disbelief as Weber fell to his knees before the smouldering wreckage of his device. Holmes, breathing hard but uninjured, stood over him. "Your light climbs no more, Weber," he said quietly. "You have mistaken brilliance for power, and both for divinity. London will remember your shadow instead." As the constables led the defeated man away and the smoke cleared from the air, Holmes turned to me with that calm detachment which so often followed his triumphs. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "the most dangerous fire is not that which burns the city. It is the one that consumes a man's reason." The events at South Kensington might have concluded the affair for most men, yet Holmes's expression, as we rode back through the flickering lamplight of the city, betrayed no satisfaction. The night was cool, the streets glistening with recent rain, and the horses' hooves struck sharp echoes that seemed to punctuate his silence. He sat opposite me, his chin resting upon his clasped fingers, eyes distant and analytical. The faint tremor of the cab's motion made his reflection in the window appear ghost-like, an image of the same restless intelligence that had haunted London's fog since the case began. At last, I broke the silence. "Surely, Holmes, this concludes the matter. Weber is under arrest, his device destroyed, and London can sleep without fear of phantoms above its rooftops." Holmes stirred slightly, as though roused from a deep calculation. "You see, my dear Watson, that is the very assumption our adversary counts upon, the superficial resolution. Yes, Weber is taken, but what does his capture truly yield us? A single man, and yet a design so intricate that it required months of preparation, access to restricted materials, and a network capable of shielding him while the Yard searched in vain. The question is not how he was caught, but who allowed him to act so long, unimpeded. You suspect others? I am certain of it." Holmes's voice grew low, almost grave. "During the confusion at the exposition, I examined the fragments of his apparatus. The wiring was not of his hand alone. There were refinements, British workmanship beyond Weber's mechanical precision. And more curious still, the main capacitor bore the initials RH etched faintly upon the brass casing. Tell me, Watson, do those initials recall anyone?" I frowned, searching memory. RH? No, unless... Wait, Sir Reginald Harker of Welbeck Street, the same whose house we first investigated. Holmes inclined his head. Just so. The trail circles back upon itself. Lady Harbury's late husband and Sir Reginald Harker were both members of the same scientific society in their youth, the Royal Electrochemical Club. Harker's house was our first scene of the Shadow's ascent. Yet we were led to believe he had been abroad for months. I now doubt he ever left London. The cab rattled to a stop outside Baker Street. Holmes leapt down before the wheels had fully halted. "Come, Watson. Sleep will not serve us yet. I must confirm one thing before dawn." Inside our rooms, he went directly to the desk and began sorting through a pile of telegrams. Selecting one, he handed it to me. It was from Lestrade, sent after Weber's arrest. Subject refuses to name accomplices, claims to have acted on behalf of the Light Society, an organization seeking to elevate mankind from the shadows. Holmes smiled grimly. The Light Society. Poetic phrasing for what I suspect. To be a cabal of financiers and scientists, each seeking profit from Weber's discoveries. And if Harker's initials mark that machine, we have one name among them. He turned suddenly to the window. The fog was thinning now, revealing a paling sky. "Watson, recall the address upon Jarvis's note, the first clue in this affair. No, 'tis 17 when the shadow climbs." We assumed it referred to Welbeck Street, yet perhaps it is not a location, but an instruction. The 17th day of the month is tomorrow. If the shadow climbs again, it will do so then. The words sent a chill through me. Then there is to be another attempt. Holmes's expression hardened. Undoubtedly. And this time the light will not climb, it will fall. Whatever Weber began, his masters intend to finish. By midday, Lestrade arrived bearing news both promising and grim. "Weber was found dead in his cell," he announced bluntly. "Apparent suicide. He left a note, half in German, half in English, raving about the cleansing dawn. The doctor says he bit through a capsule of cyanide hidden in his coat lining." Holmes received the news with cold composure. "Predictable," he said. "They could not risk his testimony." Weber was the visible hand, The invisible one has now severed the thread. Lestrade frowned. You mean someone arranged this? Indeed, said Holmes, and they will act swiftly now, believing themselves free of exposure. Inspector, I require the Yard's utmost discretion. Have the surrounding districts near Cavendish Square watched tonight, but from afar. No interference unless I send word. Watson and I will pay a call on Lady Harbury once more. There is unfinished business within her late husband's house. By dusk, we stood again before the tall, solemn facade of that mansion. Lady Harbury received us with evident distress. You've heard, then? She said. The newspapers speak of Professor Adler's disgrace. Is it truly over? Not yet, madam, Holmes replied gently. But it soon may be, if we act wisely. He paced the drawing-room, his eyes flicking from the gas fittings to the ceiling vents. Tell me, Lady Harbury, your husband's experiments, did they ever involve projection of any kind? Not merely light, but communication? She hesitated. He believed light could carry more than illumination, that it could convey thought itself by frequency and pattern. He said it would connect minds as telegraph wires connect voices. After his death, I sealed his notes in the cellar. I feared them. Holmes's eyes brightened with sudden understanding. The cellar, you say? Might I see it? We descended into a narrow chamber lined with stone. Beneath a tarpaulin, Holmes uncovered a set of machines, rusted, yet unmistakably akin to Weber's. Among them lay a large copper coil, engraved faintly with the same initials, R.H. He bent over it, studying the intricate filaments within. Remarkable, he whispered. This is no mere light projector, it is a transmitter. Weber was not its originator, but its instrument. Harker and Harbury, partners in discovery, intended to harness electrical energy through air, but their design was perverted into spectacle and destruction. The so-called Light Society seeks to weaponize what was once scientific ambition. He turned toward me, the lamplight reflecting in his eyes like twin sparks. Watson, tomorrow marks the 17th, the final stage of their plan. They will demonstrate the perfected device upon London itself, and the place most suited to such grandeur? I answered without hesitation. St. Paul's, perhaps, the highest dome in the city? Just so, said Holmes, the shadow shall climb no more. It will fall upon the heart of London, and we must be there before the light does. As we emerged once more into the night air, the bells of the city began to toll the late hour. Holmes's stride quickened, his voice low but resolute. The game is not finished, Watson. The shadow over Baker Street was but its beginning. Tomorrow we face the dawn that kills. The morning of the 17th dawned with a clarity that made London seem almost fragile in its brightness. After nights of oppressive fog, the sky above Baker Street was pale and still, a deceptive calm that only sharpened Holmes's unease. He had been awake since before dawn, the smoke from his pipe drifting like thought made visible through the open window. I found him standing there, fully dressed, his violin lying untouched upon the side table. There is a particular stillness before catastrophe, Watson, he said without turning. Even nature seems to draw breath in anticipation. This morning is precisely such a silence. Do you truly believe they will strike today? I asked. He nodded, his eyes narrowing upon the skyline. I no longer believe they must. All that we have uncovered points to this hour. Harker and his confederates have lost their agent in Weber, but the machinery is already in motion. If they mean to display their power to those who financed it, they will do so where all London can see. The Dome of St. Paul's is not only the city's highest point, it is its most symbolic, and, as you yourself observed, the perfect altar upon which light might fall. By noon we were on our way, Holmes having sent word to Lestrade to meet us with a small detachment in the cathedral's vicinity. The cab carried us through streets unusually bright, the crowds lively, with the illusion of safety. Yet Holmes's gaze was fixed upward, studying the rooftops as though the danger itself might take shape in the air above. At St. Paul's, the scene was one of almost deceptive peace. Tourists and clerics moved quietly through the square. The sun glimmered upon the dome, blinding in its brilliance. Lestrade approached, looking harried but resolute. "We've stationed men along the periphery," he whispered. "No sign of activity yet." Holmes examined the structure with the intensity of a surgeon. "He will not approach openly," he said. "If I were the architect of this display, I would conceal the apparatus within one of the maintenance vaults beneath the dome, close enough to project upward, but shielded from interference. Come, Watson, the verger will not refuse us entry." The interior of St. Paul's never failed to inspire awe, but that day its grandeur seemed almost ominous. Shafts of coloured light filtered through the stained glass, gilding the mosaics in tones of molten gold. As we ascended the narrow stairways and passed through the whispering gallery, every sound was magnified and thrown back in ghostly echoes. Holmes paused only once, kneeling to run his fingers along the brass balustrade. When he straightened, there was soot upon his fingertips. "The same crystalline residue," he murmured. "They have been here. The device must be near the apex." We climbed higher, into the dim workings of the great dome, where the air grew close and the distant sounds of the city reached us like muted thunder. There, among the labyrinth of beams and scaffolding, we found it. The machine was monstrous, larger than any we had yet seen. Copper conduits coiled like serpents through the chamber, converging upon a central cylinder that pulsed faintly with stored current. Overhead, a lens assembly aimed upward through a concealed aperture in the dome's inner shell. Around it, several crates bore the stamp of Harker & Co., electrical engineers, Welbeck Street. Holmes's expression hardened. He has transformed Weber's design into a weapon of spectacle. Once activated, this device could cast a beam bright enough to dazzle half the city, and I suspect generate a magnetic discharge that would cripple every electrical system within a mile. "Good heavens," I muttered. "And what of those below?" "They would see it as revelation, not destruction. The Society intends to demonstrate dominion over light itself, to awe Parliament, the financiers, the press. The line between wonder and terror has always been thin." Lestrade emerged from the stairwell behind us, revolver drawn. "Holmes, the verger swears no one's been up here since morning, yet we found fresh footprints in the gallery." "Then they are still within," said Holmes quietly. "Watson, seal the lower access with Lestrade's men. No one enters or leaves without my signal." We had scarcely begun to obey when a metallic clang echoed through the chamber. From the shadows behind the machinery stepped a tall figure in a dark coat, his white hair catching the slant of light. It was Sir Reginald Harker himself, though far leaner and more haggard than I remembered from his portraits. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice calm and oddly courteous. "I should have expected as much. You arrive precisely at the appointed hour." Holmes's tone was level. "So the Shadow's architect shows himself at last?" "You played your part well, Harker, sending us in circles, pretending to be abroad while your work continued above our very heads. Was Weber your creation or your pawn?" "Both," Harker replied. "He lacked vision, only hunger. I gave him purpose, and he gave me his genius. The Society needed a mind unburdened by conscience." He gestured toward the device with something like reverence. "This machine will change civilization. No more darkness, no more ignorance, light, endless and pure." "Or death by another name," Holmes said sharply. "The current you've harnessed cannot be contained." You mean to release it above one of the most densely populated districts in Europe? Even your society cannot profit from a city reduced to ash. Harker's expression flickered, the passion in his eyes dimming for a moment into something almost human. Progress demands sacrifice. Every dawn burns what came before. Holmes took a step forward. And yet, Sir Reginald, dawn may also be delayed. His hand moved suddenly, pulling a small metal clamp from his coat. With a single motion, he severed the primary conduit feeding the machine. Sparks hissed, and the soft hum faltered into silence. Harker lunged forward, striking Holmes across the arm, but Lestrade was upon him instantly. The struggle was brief, desperate. A shout, a crash of glass, and then Harker stumbled backward, his foot catching upon a cable. The great lens assembly trembled, then toppled with a deafening roar. Light flared once, brilliant and terrible, and then died, plunging the chamber into gloom. When the dust settled, Harker lay unconscious amid the wreckage, the machine a twisted ruin. Holmes stood over it, breathing hard, his sleeve torn and face streaked with soot. "It is over," I said quietly. Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, the shadow has been dispersed but not destroyed. Others of his society remain. London has escaped the fire for now, but the spark will seek another city." As we descended the long stair, the great bells of St. Paul's began to toll the hour, each peal rolling outward through the clear air. For the first time in many days, there was no fog, only the cold brightness of true morning. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his gaze fixed upon the skyline where light and smoke mingled above the waking city. "The shadow over Baker Street," he murmured, "was never truly of the night. It was man's desire to command the sun itself. And so long as that desire burns, Watson, the shadow will return." That evening, after the events at St. Paul's had left London trembling between awe and disbelief, Holmes and I returned once more to Baker Street. The lamps along the road glowed steadily, their calm brilliance a silent victory against the chaos that might have been. Mrs. Hudson had prepared tea, yet it sat untouched upon the table. Holmes was not at rest. His violin lay nearby, but he made no move toward it. Instead, he stood by the hearth, one hand pressed to the mantel, his eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire like twin mirrors of thought. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The air between us seemed dense with the weight of unfinished calculation. The city beyond our windows murmured faintly, carriages rolling home, a distant newsboy crying headlines of the great light incident. At last, Holmes turned toward me, his face drawn but his voice steady. "Watson," he said, "you may consider this case closed. The authorities will soon write it as such. They will say that Sir Reginald Harker, driven mad by ambition, conspired with a foreign inventor to create a machine of destruction. His capture and Weber's death will form a tidy moral for the public. Yet the truth is never so neat. The mind that conceived this affair was not his alone." I leaned forward. "You mean the society still lives?" He nodded. "Oh yes, the Light Society, as they style themselves, was never the fancy of a single fanatic. It is an idea, a fraternity of intellect without ethics, scattered among laboratories and lecture halls from Berlin to Edinburgh. Harker's contrivance at St. Paul's was but a trial. What they truly seek is mastery of unseen forces, electricity, magnetism, radiation, energies that may one day rule nations as gunpowder once did. It is a vision too tempting to perish with one failure." "But surely," I protested, "the Yard would trace their communications, their finances. You have evidence enough." Holmes interrupted with a faint, almost weary smile. "Evidence enough for understanding, my dear fellow, but not for conviction. Their operations are veiled by respectability. They wear the garments of progress, and the world applauds them for it. If I accused a dozen eminent gentlemen of conspiracy today, I should be laughed out of London tomorrow. No, our work in this instance must end where theirs begins, in silence. He turned back to the fire, and for a moment I saw the toll that the night's exertions had taken upon him. His usually precise hands trembled slightly as he set his pipe upon the mantel. "We have saved the city from spectacle, Watson, but not from its appetite for wonder. That appetite will draw men like Harker again, and each time the shadow may rise higher before it falls." I poured the tea at last, urging him to sit. He obeyed reluctantly, his long frame folding into the armchair as though by command rather than comfort. "You speak of appetite," I said. "Yet is that not the same desire that drives discovery? Surely there must be a difference between curiosity and corruption." Holmes regarded me with that familiar, sharp affection that so often accompanied his lectures. "There is a difference, indeed. Curiosity seeks truth. Corruption seeks power. Weber wished to illuminate mankind. Harker wished to rule it. Between those two desires lies all the peril of civilization. Mark me, Watson, the age of light is dawning, but it will cast the darkest shadows we have ever known." A silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and deliberate, as if washing away the last ashes of that perilous night. At length I said, "And what of Lady Harbury? Shall she be told the full measure of her husband's connection to these men?" Holmes's gaze softened. "No, she has suffered enough. The scandal of it would destroy her, and she was as much a victim as any. Her husband's ambitions were his own undoing, but her conscience remains unsoiled. Let her believe that the light which haunted her house has been extinguished forever. It is not untrue, it merely sleeps." He rose and crossed to the window. The rain blurred the gaslights into halos of gold, and for an instant the scene outside looked almost ethereal. "Do you recall, Watson," he said quietly, "when Jarvis first came to our door, the way he clutched that watch, the terror in his eyes? All that has followed began in that single moment of faith. He brought us a warning, and though it cost him his life, it may have saved thousands. There is no small courage in such a messenger." I joined him at the window. "Then it ends as it began, with one man's shadow cast upon the light." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his profile outlined against the rain-streaked glass. "Yes, and in that shadow lies our purpose, yours and mine. Others may chase glory, we chase balance. When brilliance grows too proud, it must be reminded of its limits. That perhaps is the truest service reason can offer the world." He drew the curtain, closed, and turned once more toward the fire. The warmth caught his features and lent them a fleeting gentleness. For a moment he seemed older, more human, less the unyielding machine of deduction the world imagined him to be. "I shall write my report for the Yard," he said after a pause. "Lestrade will receive his commendation, and the papers will call this the shadow over Baker Street, no doubt. Let them. The public craves titles more than truths." "And you?" I asked. "Will you rest, now that the matter is concluded?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Rest, perhaps, when the city does. Until then, there are patterns in this world that have yet to reveal themselves. Tonight's light was man-made, but somewhere, I suspect, another will rise, and when it does, Baker Street will not sleep." He lowered himself into the chair once more and finally reached for his violin. The first notes were low and contemplative, filling the room with a melancholy resonance that matched the rhythm of the rain. I took up my pen quietly, knowing this was not a tale for sensation but for reflection, a record of a victory that felt more like a reprieve than an ending. When the melody faded, Holmes set down the instrument and looked toward me with a trace of amusement. "You'll write it, Watson," he said. "You always do, but be kind, my friend. Do not make me out a hero. The world has enough illusions of its own." I promised him that much. And as the fire dwindled to embers, I felt that curious mingling of pride and humility that so often accompanied our adventures, the sense that we had stood once more at the edge of darkness, not to banish it, but to understand it. Outside, the bells of St. Mary-le-Bone tolled midnight, their sound drifting through the wet air. Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed, the faintest smile upon his lips. "Listen, Watson," he murmured. "The city breathes again. Let us be grateful for one quiet night. The dawn will come soon enough, and with it, perhaps, another shadow to chase." And so it was that the case of the shadow over Baker Street ended, not with applause or headlines, but with rain against the glass, a fading tune upon the strings, and the unspoken certainty that the light which saves us is never far from the darkness that tests it. The following morning broke grey and subdued, London moving through its daily rhythm with that peculiar resilience that marks a city accustomed to balancing peril with progress. The newspapers had already printed their versions of the affair, some hailing Lestrade's courageous intervention, others marvelling at the phantom lights seen above St. Paul's. None named Holmes directly, though a column in the Times remarked that an unnamed consulting specialist of Baker Street had once again rendered invaluable assistance to the Yard. Holmes read this without comment, folding the paper neatly upon his knee as he sat at breakfast. "You observe, Watson," he said at length, "how the world prefers its mysteries simplified. To the public this will always be the story of one deranged scientist whose ambition outstripped his reason. They will never suspect the web beneath, the society behind the man, the financiers behind the society, nor the motives that burn quietly behind the curtain of progress." I stirred my tea, watching him over the rim of my cup, and yet perhaps that ignorance is a mercy. London is calmer for its illusions. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of it. Yes, civilization rests, I suspect, upon a very thin fabric of illusion, stitched with law, morality, and the comforting notion that light is always benevolent. Last night tore a small hole in that fabric, but it will mend itself by morning, as it always does. We sat in thoughtful silence for a time, the clatter of carriages outside punctuating our quiet like the steady tick of destiny. The fire hissed softly in the grate, and the familiar scent of tobacco mingled with the faint tang of ozone still lingering from Holmes's experiments of the previous evening. I could not shake the image of that great beam of light arcing over London, the brilliance that could have destroyed as easily as it dazzled. At last I said, "And what of Harker?" Holmes looked up, his expression unreadable. "He will face trial, though I suspect his mind will not bear the weight of it. The shock of failure, the ruin of his devices, the exposure of his name, all these have already shattered him." He spoke to me briefly before dawn, while still under guard. He asked a curious question, whether light could forgive those who misused it. I could offer him no answer. "Nor could anyone," I murmured. Holmes rose and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze distant. "And yet there lies the final paradox of this affair. Every discovery that uplifts mankind carries within it the seed of destruction. It is not the invention, but the intent that determines whether light heals or burns. Men like Harker imagine themselves gods because they command energy, but true mastery lies only with those who understand consequence. He paused, turning toward the window. Outside, the rain had cleared, leaving the streets glistening like freshly polished silver. The sun broke through at that moment, its reflection flashing along the panes opposite. Holmes smiled faintly. Appropriate, is it not? Even the purest illumination blinds when it falls too directly upon the eye. I think I shall remember that. There came a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a small parcel addressed to Holmes in a hand both elegant and trembling. "Brought by a messenger, sir," she said. "No return address?" Holmes accepted it, turning it over carefully before cutting the string. Inside lay the silver watch that had begun the entire case, the very one Jarvis had delivered with his dying breath. Its glass had been replaced, its hands reset, and upon the inside lid a new engraving had been added beneath the old inscription, "To those who guard the light from the shadow, E.H." Holmes regarded it for several moments before closing the lid gently. "Lady Harbury," he said softly. "A token of gratitude, perhaps, or of closure?" "She knows the truth, then?" I asked. "Not all of it," Holmes replied. "Only enough to let her sleep without fear. That, I think, is the kindest truth any of us may hope for." He placed the watch upon the mantel, where its ticking soon blended with the clock's rhythm, a quiet harmony that filled the room. The rest of the day passed in reflection. Lestrade called briefly to deliver official thanks and, in his usual brusque manner, to admit that perhaps there was something in your theory after all, Mr. Holmes. Holmes accepted this with a thin smile, neither vain nor dismissive, but simply content that the puzzle had resolved itself according to reason. As evening fell, I found him seated once more at his desk, sketching diagrams of the machine we had dismantled. The firelight painted his face in alternating shadow and gold. "You're documenting the device?" I asked. "In part," he said, "but more than that, I am recording the pattern of human folly that attends every great leap forward. When men reach too high for the light, they forget to watch the ground beneath their feet. I suspect, Watson, that future generations will invent wonders beyond imagining, but they will still need someone to remind them of the fall that follows pride." He glanced towards me, his tone softening. "And perhaps someone to write it down?" I smiled, understanding the invitation. "You mean to make me your historian again?" "My mirror, rather," he said. "You reflect what I overlook: humanity, compassion, the moral lens through which deduction must be tempered. Without it, observation becomes mere machinery." The clock struck 9. Outside, the gas lamps were being lit along Baker Street one by one, their warm halos pushing back the encroaching dusk. Holmes watched them for a moment, then spoke with a calm finality. "And so the shadow passes, as all shadows must. But mark me, Watson, the day it ceases to fall is the day mankind no longer casts one." He sank back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest, the faintest ghost of satisfaction upon his lips. I left him there, the firelight flickering upon his sharp features, and thought how many times I had seen that same silhouette, the thin, angular figure of a man who wrestled nightly with the boundaries between brilliance and darkness. Outside, the lamps gleamed steadily in the clear night air, and above them the moon rose pale and distant, casting its quiet glow over Baker Street. And as I turned to extinguish the lamp by my desk, I thought how fitting it was that the final word in that strange affair belonged not to the light nor the shadow, but to the man who forever walked between them.